Section F, revising is rewriting.
So, what does revision mean and how do you do it? Well, we've already been doing it for a while in this program. You see, the word revision means to see again in a new way. You have a new vision of what you've already written.
I tried to revise my paper by cutting it up line by line and pasting it back together. It didn't work very well.
Now, when we say revision, we mean that you're entirely rethinking your paper. You're not just sticking in some commas here and there and rearranging the words in a couple of sentences. You're taking a step back from your paper and re-examining your thesis, argument, introduction, etc., etc.
And one other tidbit about revision. It doesn't happen only at the end of the writing process. You're doing it the whole time. You rethink your ideas with every free write, every outline, and every rough draft you do. As you get research or as you get feedback from others, you're rethinking your paper. You're constantly going back and thinking, is that exactly what I mean to say? So let's go back to Nathan. He's taken a rest from his paper and then gone back and looked it over again and made some changes.
Nathan now has a second draft of his paper. You can read it for yourself on the insert card labeled paper number 2. You can follow the changes we will make to this draft by looking at the essay labeled paper number 3.
So here's the scoop on Nathan's second draft. He's elaborated on his descriptions of the different groups. He's added to his conclusion and introduction. He's also inserted some quotations and paraphrases from his outside readings into his paper where he thinks they fit.
Now, in revising his paper, Nathan hasn't changed his opinions on what he's written. Sometimes when you revise a piece of writing, you'll totally change the way you look at the content. Nathan has expanded on his opinions and made them more specific, but he hasn't changed his views on high school groups. Nathan's focused more on reorganizing and clarifying his writing.
Nathan decides to take the second draft of his paper to his professor to get some feedback. Remember, you get good feedback by asking specific questions of your reader. So Nathan's put together the following list of questions for his professor.
First question, does my thesis statement have an interesting position on the topic? Second, does my argument back up my thesis? Third, have I used my research well? And finally, are my introduction and conclusion engaging to my reader, and do they reflect the focus of my paper?
Remember, what questions you choose to ask your reader depend upon what stage of the writing process you're in, what concerns you have about the assignment, and who your reader is.
So let's take a look at the comments of Nathan's professor and talk about a few more aspects of writing in college.
His first comment is Nathan's title for the paper, High School Groups. His professor feels that it should engage the reader more. The way it is now, it says what the subject of the paper is, but doesn't catch the reader's attention.
When you're trying to decide on a title, you want a title that reflects what you've written and makes someone want to read more of your paper. Now, obviously, if you're doing a lab report on freezing points, you don't need to come up with some catchy title like Brr, Temperature, and You. But from your title, your reader should know what to expect from your paper and be interested by it.
Nathan decides to change his paper to Lions and Tigers and Nerds, oh my! This title plays off the reference to The Wizard of Oz and the subject of the paper.
Coming up next, the second comment.
The professor's next comment is Nathan's reference to a John Hughes film. He thinks the reference is too obscure and might distract the reader if he or she didn't know who John Hughes is.
When Sam read his paper, she didn't comment on Nathan's John Hughes reference because she knew it. Nathan's professor is from a different generation and doesn't know the reference. The professor is Nathan's audience, so Nathan decides to take the sentence out. His professor's next comment is about Nathan's next two sentences. When you try to label people, stereotypes and generalizations abound. But here, for the sake of humor and social justice, I will blatantly label and mock based on my experiences in public high school.
Remember earlier we said that one of the characteristics of good academic prose is an awareness of other points of view? That's what Nathan is doing here.
Nathan's acknowledging that these are just his opinions based on his personal experiences.
Let's go back to the comment Nathan's professor made. Nathan said these are only his opinions based on his personal experiences, but his professor thinks Nathan should also identify other biases he might bring to his observations based on his economic class, race, and gender. So Nathan adds a couple sentences.
He writes, "The phenomenon of social groups among adolescents occurs across racial, gender, and economic divisions, in rural and urban areas, and in both public and private high schools. This paper will concentrate on my own experiences, that of a white, middle-class male at a public high school."
Nathan's managed to do a couple things with these added sentences.
First, he's identified who he is and that the groups he's breaking high school into are only based on his own experiences. But this sentence also states that social groups form everywhere. Lots of other people have had the same experiences as Nathan. Even though Nathan's argument is based on his own observations, he can still argue that his paper reflects high school groups in other places as well.
A third comment the professor makes is about Nathan's thesis statement. His current thesis is, students in public high school can be broken down into 3 general groups, the coolies, the nerds, and the fledgling middle class. These groups, once defined, can then be broken down into a number of subgroups. His professor believes it's too vague and needs to state a more focused and stronger position. So Nathan needs to state a stronger thesis. There's lots of ways to make your thesis better.
For example, you can talk to your professor or another student about your paper. Or you can go back and reread your research and your paper. Any of these ways can help you find holes in your argument or can help stimulate new ideas for your topic by putting a charge in your thinking. Nathan's decided to add to his previous thesis statement by rereading his research.
The stuff I've collected shows that the different characteristics of each group create boundaries between high school students. It's like there's a line or a boundary between the groups, like the jocks are over here and the nerds are over here, and it's very difficult for them to cross over.
Based on this research, Nathan writes the following thesis statement. Students in public high school can be broken down into 3 general groups, the coolies, the nerds, and the fledgling middle class. These groups, once defined, can then be broken down into a number of subgroups, each with distinct characteristics which function as boundaries and barriers among students within the high school culture.
This thesis statement is better because it adds depth to Nathan's previous thesis statement and makes it more specific. By adding that these groups function as boundaries and barriers among students within the high school culture, Nathan shows how important groups are in high school. He makes his argument stronger by showing how these groups function.
Whenever you revise your thesis statement, you want to be sure the rest of your paper reflects that change. Why? Because all the supporting paragraphs in your paper should back up your thesis.
Also, even though you may see how your supporting paragraphs back up your thesis, your reader might not. That's why we stick in transition sentences.